Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here this morning. You know, in Albany, sometimes we do things for partisan reasons, ideological reasons, and that's not bad. You know, that's part of the give and take of government. But once in a while, there's issues that I think transcend partisanship that really should be bipartisan, and human trafficking is one of those issues. And about a year ago, Brian Marr came to my office and said, you know, we ought to set up a task force to look into human trafficking. And thanks to Brian Marr and Mary Beth Walsh, these guys have traveled the state taking testimony, and I want to say thank you to the brave people that came forward, particularly those who are victims of human trafficking, came forward and gave testimony. In fact, we did a event in John Lamonti's district, and we had John Walsh from America's Most Wanted there, and he was a very dynamic speaker and really spoke about victims' rights, I think, very eloquently. But nevertheless, they wrapped up the task force. We put together, staff and members who worked very hard, put together a report. And we're very optimistic that this report can lead to legislation that ultimately, I think, Republicans, Democrats, everybody in New York State wants to see a solution to the terrible tragedy of human trafficking. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Marr. He's going to tell a little about the report and about the task force. And then we're going to hear from a few other people going forward. So, Brian.
Thank you, Leader. Compassion in action, fighting human trafficking together. That is the theme of our report, but it means so much more to the folks that have been involved in this process over the better part of the last year. So how did we get here today? We heard about 6 months to a year ago testimony from individuals that had been trafficked. And for me, personally, being educated on all of these atrocities that are happening in every corner of our state, it was something that really took me back. And once I was educated and had that knowledge that this problem exists and is so prevalent, we then found that it would be our responsibility to do our best to, one, have the conversation, but then also provide legislative and financial recommendations. So what did we do? The first order of business when tackling any issue is to humble ourselves and say, hey, we just don't know enough. We need to educate ourselves. We need to bring the best talents, the most experienced individuals dealing with this crisis, from law enforcement to nonprofit to education, bring them together, have conversations, and start there. And that's what we did. With an incredible team of over a dozen members that hosted and attended more than 11 different forums in every region of the state of New York, we have in this report 64 bullet point recommendations, over a dozen bills, some existing, some new, and many more on the way. You're going to hear from my co-chair, Assemblymember Mary Beth Walsh. You're going to hear from a trafficking survivor and some others that have been part of our conversations and our work. But to give you an idea of some of the things that we have focused on, our highlighted recommendations, we talked about nonprofit resources and services. We talked about New York red tape and bureaucracy and the sheer form of how funding is going through our nonprofits, making it almost impossible for our nonprofits to operate and utilize the resources, both federal and New York State, that are available to them. We talked about education and training, obviously housing, which is one of the most important part of the wraparound services that we know need to be provided to trafficking victims. And when we talked about the issue of human trafficking around the tables, we understood and found out that the services being provided to domestic violence victims and so many others is not enough. And so when it comes to being trafficked, you have no chance. We need to do better in this state as we enter into the final phase of a budget that could be over $250 billion. We have the resources to do better. We should do better. We need to do better. And hopefully this report can be a blueprint to address some of these recommendations. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-chair, Assemblymember Mary Beth Walsh.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Brian, because his leadership on this issue has been phenomenal. And I want to thank the staff that has worked to generate this 50-page report. I mean, I've been involved, this is my 9th year in the Assembly, and I've worked on a number of these task forces, but this is by far the most comprehensive, most thorough approach to any topic I think that we've undertaken, and the work product really shows it. So in just a couple of minutes, I just want to hit maybe just a couple of points, and then let's turn it over to the other people that participated and were stakeholders and really know what they're talking about. I think for me, the most impactful trip that we made as part of the task force for me was when we went out to Western New York, and we were in the Buffalo area. We met with Customs and Border Patrol, and we were briefed specifically on the northern border and about how trafficking is being facilitated across that border. As somebody who grew up in the Capital Region, I've spent my whole life as an upstate resident. I guess I didn't really know or really fully appreciate just how porous that northern border is, and how, in fact, if you take a look at just due north of us here, around the Messina area, that area is really the hot spot for a lot of these border crossings that are going on. And while we know that not all of the individuals that are coming across will be trafficked, and one of the things that Border Control talked about with us was that a lot of people, when they're first coming across, they don't know yet that they're about to be trafficked. They don't know. But that a huge red flag is that if they no longer have control over their documents, they run the real risk that part of the price that they may have to pay for having made the crossing is going to be in the form of labor or sex trafficking. And that really hit me hard, and it really drove the point across that we tried to make as a conference a couple weeks ago when we had Tom Holman here, and he was talking about 300,000 children that he believes are missing somewhere in the United States. Are all of them being trafficked? No. Many of them have come to the United States and are safely with family members, and we thank God that they are. But there are missing children that need to be accounted for, and I know John Walsh talked about that, as the leader mentioned, when we were in the Syracuse area at that task force. I think that one of the things that I've been happy to do is, Assemblymember Marr mentioned a number of pieces of legislation that are going to be introduced. Either they were already pieces of legislation or they've been developed specifically in response to this task force. The one that I'll just briefly mention that I'm carrying is Assembly Bill 7003, and it's a really simple bill. It eliminates the criminal statute of limitations for sex trafficking and sex trafficking of a child, both Class B violent felonies, and it extends the criminal statute of limitations for sex trafficking felonies designated as nonviolent. And one thing that I found very interesting to learn is that that exact recommendation that's in that Assembly bill was part of the governor's proposal in her budget. But unfortunately, when the One House budgets came out, the Assembly rejected that language, and we're just very simply saying that it should be put back in. It should be part of our final budget, or it could be passed as a standalone bill. I don't really care how it's done, but I think it needs to get done. It's a very simple change, and really what it will do is it will the statute of limitations for sex trafficking and sex trafficking against a child right now is 5 years. This would align the law with the other changes that were made even as recently as a couple of years ago, having to do with the Child Victims Act and other statute of limitations changes that were made. So I'll turn it over to Brian to introduce our next speaker, but I found this really an amazing process and a very substantive report, and I do hope that as a conference and as an assembly body, as a state, that we can really make good use of it. A lot of work went into it, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. So I recommend it to all of our media partners who are here today to take a hard look at it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Mary Beth. We met some amazing stakeholders, but none were more important and impactful than survivors of trafficking. and an amazing organization that actually has these individuals on their board, PACT, to protect all children from trafficking, we met several, and it was really humbling. We have with us today Katrina Massey, a survivor of trafficking, one of the most inspiring people that I've met, along with Melanie Thompson and several others. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce her to come in and address you all.
Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for having me. First and foremost, from all of us, thank you for supporting survivors. This report was something that we definitely considered special. It considered the full scope of the experience of a trafficked person, and it's one of the first that I've seen. But thank you again. My name is Katrina Massey, and you know, I'm a New York real estate agent, I'm an advocate, I'm a wife and mom of 6. I've spent 15 years creating exceptional experiences in restaurants across the country. I'm a PTA president. I'm the daughter of a preacher and a middle-class family, a community organizer, and I just happen to be a survivor of sex trafficking. And I say all of that to say, you know, if you were to cross me in the street, or say, for instance, you know, I sold you your home in Long Island or in Manhattan, the stories that we all in this room carry has weight, and it means something. And it is attributed to my ability to do the work that I do today. And at the time of my experience, little was acknowledged or spoken about in regards to sex trafficking. Although I met a phenomenal and pioneering mentor at that time, it was the beginning. It was the beginning. So I had to navigate my healing. I had to find my footing on my own, and wished there were reports like this that existed then. I wish that there were organizations like Restore NYC, Sanctuary for Families, or even Project Mona's House that existed, and many more that are across the state. This report, it's a great starting point. And I support supportive housing. You know, as I think of some of the bullet points and recommendations of this report, I have to think about, you know, I started off doing direct services almost 20 years ago and working directly with victims of sex trafficking. And at that time, I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and we had a single point of entry for the entire state for anyone that was suspected to be a victim of sex trafficking or people that were known to be victims of sex trafficking. And as we discussed this report, it allowed me to reflect back on those times, because this robust task force that we speak of in this report is something that's absolutely needed. I've had the opportunity to sit at tables month in and month out where I'm meeting with FBI agents, GBI, we're meeting with school officials, and we're going through reports, and we have action plans in place on how we're going to protect children from trafficking. And what's beautiful about coming to the table and collectively working together, you start seeing some of the same names of victims that were, oh, this person was just in my county 6 months ago. Oh, this person that's now missing, because I'm doing direct services with these victims, I now know who's missing, who's in school, what's the actual progress of a victim. That takes money. We have to be able to pay nonprofit organizations so that when I get that call at 3 a.m. and I need to meet law enforcement, and they're like, I don't know if am I taking her to jail? Am I taking her to a drop-in center? I don't know what to do with her. She's telling me she's 18. She clearly looks like she's 14. I need support. Law enforcement needs support. And they need support from those who know this from the inside out. And I imagine, you know, a world that when I exited, there was supportive housing. And supportive housing may mean somewhere within New York City, but most importantly, somewhere outside of the city. When working with the organization that I worked with previously doing direct services, that was one of our biggest challenges. We could find places to take people within the city, but we had many whose traffickers were still in the city, had not been located, had not been arrested. We need to get them away from that point of trauma. And there's just not enough. There's not enough. We need supportive housing. And what does that supportive housing look like? You know, I've worked in some amazing residential programs where you're learning life skills. Because if you're being trafficked at 13 or 14 years old, have you learned how to cook? Some people have, but most people hadn't. Have you learned how to wash your own clothes? You know, one specific victim that I will never forget, I received a crisis phone call, and that's kind of a like, I need you right here, right now, within 2 hours. And I met them, and she just had a domestic violence incident. Her trafficker attacked her, and in that moment of crisis, she knew who to call. And she called a law enforcement officer that she had only come in contact with once or twice, and I met them there. So she had been out all night. Are you hungry? We went to a local diner. We sat down. We're going through the menu. We're going through, I've made a decision, he's made a decision, we're ready to order. She had not made a decision, and at that time she was 19. 5 or 10 minutes pass, and I ask again, are you ready to order? And she looked up from her menu, and she said that I've been with my trafficker since I was 13 years old. I've never decided on what I wanted to eat. I never decided on what I wanted to wear. I didn't decide on what time I woke up. And this is the first time that I'm able to make this decision. And she had no clue. This was like burgers, fries, you know, pancakes, sausage, bacon, very standard, nothing complex. So when you think of supportive housing, you think the basic needs, food, shelter, clothing. But when you now compound the basic needs with childhood trauma, because we know that 80% of those who have been trafficked were also sexually abused. And then you compound trafficking, domestic violence, possibly drug use, and now you're planting your feet back in what we consider normal society, and now that you're away from this, everything in life just, the bulb goes off. It doesn't happen that easy. And that's why we need these services. That's why that support is needed. And more importantly, or most importantly, from a prevention perspective, again, I mentioned 80% of those trafficked have reported being sexually abused. So when we think about laws that are surrounding child abuse, we can catch this stuff before it gets worse, before those vulnerabilities are exploited. We can tap into that. And then also, robust, ongoing, trauma-informed training for law enforcement, social workers, first responders, anyone that comes in contact with children. Because you never know when that moment of crisis may hit for that victim, but oftentimes they are in contact with someone who cares for children, and if that law enforcement officer doesn't know what to do, then what? Or oftentimes they end up in the emergency room. Does the nurse know what to do? Because no one walks in the door and say, hi, I'm being trafficked, help. Most victims don't self-identify. So you have to have these support systems that they feel safe, that they feel that it's okay if I speak up, I know that there's a place for me. There's a beginning for me. And training also gives a place of safety and a place of, I'll be treated with dignity, no matter what happened to me. Because the traffickers instill in your minds that the shame of this trauma and this experience doesn't wash off, it doesn't leave you. But having that circle of support, whether it be your therapist, whether it be a housing specialist, whether it be government officials who care about these issues, those are the things that matter. And the last thing that I want to say, the most common question that I get when I'm speaking, they're like, why don't they just leave? Why is it so hard for them to leave? And the best response that I can give to most people is, hey, why don't you drop the 30 pounds you've been struggling with? Why don't you stop smoking that cigarette that you've swore to your wife that you would stop smoking for the last decade? That same mental shift is the same thing that has to happen for that victim. And they have to come to a place. I know for me, the fear of staying became greater than the fear of the unknown and leaving my trafficker. That balance, you have to come to that place where, what is it worth to me? And seeing this report is refreshing, it's hopeful, and I hope that this is the beginning of a longer, deeper, more in-depth conversation where there are actions and bills put in place to help support victims of trafficking. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Katrina. Next, our next speaker is a friend that we've known for years. He served here for a while in the New York State Assembly. He was our floor leader. He's now the Washington County District Attorney. Would you please welcome Tony Jordan?
Wow, I had a lot of remarks prepared in my head, but then to follow Katrina, you realize, I think what struck me right at the very end is it gives her hope, right? And think about someone who has endured and survived to stand here and say, a simple act by Leader Barclay to recognize an issue, but then the courage to push it forward, gives someone who's endured so much hope. And I think that really ought to be the message we carry from today, is that there is hope on an issue that is so important. And I think the leader said it at the beginning, this cuts across political, geographical, socioeconomic bounds. Victims are everywhere, right? They're in my town of Jackson, which has about 1,000 people. They are in the major metropolitan areas, and I think as we saw reported locally, they've located over 60 children and young women who are being trafficked. That is the importance of this task force that was led by Brian and Mary Beth, and they did great work on this, is that it begins to change our view of what it means to be a victim of human trafficking. It is not the view that we held in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? It is in our own communities. And so I think for that reason, what the 21st century brings is hope, and I think it's because of the start that this task force brings about. A couple of things I'd like to highlight. Mary Beth gave me focus because she does know me. I could talk for hours, especially on an issue this important, but it's, we need community involvement, and you're starting to see that. Church groups, business groups, community groups are starting to recognize the need locally to do more for victims. We need government action, and that's where, under the leader's guidance, I really think we're going to see something happen in a place that often moves at glacial speed. But I think on an issue this important, there's a few simple proposals that I would like to highlight, and I just want to make sure I get them correct. But the first is evaluating our current fiscal structure. How are we supporting communities in this battle? How are we in New York State helping law enforcement who are on the street, social workers? How are we helping them not only identify, but then deliver important services? You heard housing. The next issue that I think is vital is, it's nice to have victims being put first on an issue coming out of Albany. And that has often been lost. And here we have some important things that I think Katrina really touched on great. Control, addiction, and violence. That is what we see when we see these cases, is always involved on some level. And one of the things that happened in New York 5 years ago was they changed who can be held and on what types of crimes can they be held. Imagine being a victim who finally weighed the balance that Katrina balanced and leaves and goes to law enforcement, seeks help, but also has the courage to identify her abuser, her captor, if you will, only to find out he's going to be released before she leaves meeting with social services. So one of the proposals that's important here is to change the definition of human trafficking as the type of crime and make it a violent felony offense. One, it gives recognition to the reality that our young victim has experienced. Two, it allows judges to set bail. That allows law enforcement, I know we have a member here, who can look at the victim in the eye and say, I think there's a great chance that person will be held. That gives our victim a chance to find the courage and the escape route that they need to move on. Lastly, our system is kind of interesting in terms of what are deemed violent versus nonviolent offenses. And so the other thing I think that is proposed that is great is to change the definition of bail-eligible offenses to simply add any of the crimes that fit within the human trafficking type of penal law offenses as being bail eligible. Again, we need to allow our victims to have the confidence that they will have a place to go and their abuser will be held if they have the courage to come forward. So there's a lot of great things here. I do also agree with the statute of limitations on a simple point of children victims. It takes years to have the courage to come forward. And we should not allow our criminal justice system to deprive them of the chance to have some justice in their lives. So again, thank you, Leader, for letting me be a part of this, and thank you all.
All right, our last speaker, and then just a quick word to close it out before questions. We have with us a member of our law enforcement community, Chief Meredith McGovern of the Orange County Sheriff's Office.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here today and to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of my Sheriff, Paul Arteta, in regards to this very serious and pervasive issue that, quite frankly, affects some of our most vulnerable populations. He's asked me to come here today to deliver his message on human trafficking, which is that law enforcement throughout the state is working diligently to combat human trafficking. However, many of the recent justice reforms of 2019 and 2020 have impeded our efforts and often keep victims in further danger. So while many of our lawmakers were well-meaning in creating these changes to the law, a lot of them have done more harm to victims and do more to shield perpetrators from punishment. So it's time that lawmakers need to make substantive changes to these laws and include their law enforcement partners in the conversation so that we can all make significant headways into combating this issue. And just wanted to touch on one other thing from a law enforcement perspective, and you've already heard it here from some of the other speakers who came before me, is that need for training. And training really specifically at the level of the patrolman who's out on the street every day, because they don't have the background in this or the information to know how to respond to it. Typically, these officers that are out every day doing their regular calls, whether it's going and responding to domestic violence incidents, taking general complaints, or dealing and interacting with homeless youth, they are the first people who are going to come into contact with these potential victims. But they don't really know how to respond to it. They're not equipped and they don't have the training to deal with this highly nuanced problem. So that's where I think the state and DCJS can really step in and work with law enforcement in creating a training platform that's focused on anti-human trafficking. And it needs to come in a form that even the smallest police department can deliver this training to their members in-house. I think that's very important. And it can't just be a one-off training. It's something that has to be always evolving because the landscape of this problem is always evolving. And it needs to be constantly updated. And the cops that are going to be out on the street needs to be constantly updated on the changes and the trends and the legal considerations as they change. And I think at this point, it's a training and a process that's not only going to be beneficial, but is going to be necessary in order to confront this pervasive and developing problem. Thank you for your time.
You can answer the questions. Okay, any questions on the task force? I'm going to give it to Brian to answer because he's much more educated on that than I am. But go ahead.
Yeah,
I had a question for Katrina.
sure.
Are you willing to take a question?
Absolutely.
When I was listening to you, you gave a rather clinical remarks about what happened. Can you personalize it and tell me what actually happened with you and your journey and your, and how old, when did this start?
So we don't have enough time for that. I was a teenager. I was working my first job as a hostess, 17. I was working as a hostess at a restaurant, and there was a gentleman that came in, and traffickers have different tactics. This one specifically is what they would call a Romeo pimp or a Romeo trafficker. What they do is they woo you. They become your quote-unquote boyfriend. They often lie about their names, they lie about their ages, and that's what happened to me. And before I knew it, there was repayment for all the things that were done. And what did that look like? There was no going back home. At that time, I was living in Atlanta. He moved me to New York City. And that's where things got really bad for me, being here in the city. So one thing they do is they isolate you. They isolate you from your family, they isolate you from your friends, and they put you in other places that you're not familiar with. So oftentimes, you know, you're not walking away. I got arrested a few times during that journey, and many of you here may know, I've only recently learned this. I sit on the board with him at PACT, and we were at a conference, and we were just having general conversation, and after knowing him now for 7 years, he said, I was the judge that you came in front of. And it's Honorable Judge Camacho out of Long Island. And I had been arrested a few times, and for some reason, I don't know if it was just the will of God or what, I came in front of him more than once. And at that point in time, it was like, either you're going to Rikers or you can go talk to this lady in the back, because we have an incarceration alternative program. Obviously, I chose door number 2. Yes. And I came in contact with I call her a pioneer of this movement. Her name is Rachel Lloyd. She had an organization, or has an organization by the name of GEMS. And that was the start of my exit. And keep in mind, when you have these programs and victims come in contact with these programs, again, we don't self-identify. So it's a process, you know. And I tell those who want to get into this work, this is not a one-off, you know, it's like, oh, I rescued you and now your life is great. No, this is work. You know, they say it takes 7 times for a domestic violence, you know, spouse to leave their partner. Now, make this, you know, take that same scenario and think of a teenager. A teenager who's still developing that frontal lobe to make proper decisions. A teenager who's now been traumatized beyond their imagination, and they're having to make that decision.
Is that your case?
That was the case for me. I left multiple times, and I didn't identify as a victim, because I think oftentimes when saying you're a victim, there's shame that comes with that. There's shame that comes with that, and that can create a process of, well, it's a process of healing that must start, but it can come with depression. It can come with all kinds of things that affect different victims in different ways, because this is not a cookie cutter, you know, what you do for one victim you can't do for the next. It's very different for each and every one.
So you say you were.
Mark, we got to keep, the final, you can ask that, go ahead. Yeah, maybe afterwards then, Mark, because we have other.
We can talk afterwards.
Afterwards, just talk afterwards. I know, we have to move on though, Mark. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Vaughn, and then we'll take you, Kate. Go ahead, Vaughn, and then I'll take Kate.
Leader or some of them are just backtracking a little bit on the formation of the task force. Were Democrats asked to be involved at all? Just was,
Sure.
If not, where do you think there are areas for cooperation here?
Well, I think the issue itself, as I said in my opening remarks, calls out for bipartisan work. And I have no reason to think we can't get some cooperation on it, other than sometimes in Albany, as you know, because it's, you know, introduced by a Republican, the Democrats are against it. But I think this issue, as I said, transcends hopefully some of that partisanship and political back and forth that we see in other issues. We do these task forces, as you know, we do several task forces during the year. Our goal is go out, get information, hear testimony, and then we bring them back to Albany and try to express our experience in these task forces. So not that we wanted to not include Democrats, but it's really a minority conference initiative that we do. So now that we have the report, I think we're educated on the issue, and we can go out and we'll shop it around with the majority. I'm confident that we'll get, you know, we probably won't get everything done, but maybe we can get, if nothing else, Vaughn, maybe we can have a conversation about it. You know, that's a good start. And so now people can look at this task force, look at the report and say, all right, this is a roadmap that maybe we can follow to take care of this terrible tragedy.
My question's actually kind of along the same line, so just wanted to be clear on that. So this isn't like you asked people who were
Right.
ready to participate here, and they said no.
Right, nothing like that. And again, we're not excluding them necessarily. If they, you know, were around, they want to come to one of these hearings or meetings we had, that's fine. But really, this is a Assembly Republican initiative. And now that we have the report done, we'll certainly be sharing it with all our colleagues in the legislature.
And also, I think Senator Walsh had mentioned that the governor had your bill in her budget proposal this year. So is that, have you had any conversations, I don't know, with anyone about that, or trying to get that back in?
Well, we certainly will, and this is where things do become a little partisan, where I do worry about some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, more worried about the criminal than they are in the victims. And certainly human trafficking certainly has a lot of tragic victims involved here. And, you know, we talked, as Tony Jordan talked about, our conference has been strongly against cashless bail and those things. You know, this seems like an issue that hopefully the majority can hear from the victims and understand that people are really tragically getting affected by these laws, and we ought to make the laws so make all our communities safer. Yep. Anything else? Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good work.
Thank you, sir.
Fabulous.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mark, you can ask